Wanted to do a extension exercise basically today, talking about government shutdown. So we will talk a little bit about an activity at the end, towards the end of this session, that talks about how the federal government is funded. That is a government activity, so it ties in with this. Also wanted to bring this up because I think it is a pretty important topic, since we are seeing that there has been discussion about government shutdown here coming up. If you don't know, today is December 19th of 2018, and the Congress needs to create a budget by this Friday coming up. There has been some debate back and forth between Congress and the president as to what that funding is going to look like, or if the government is going to be shut down based on some challenges that they're having regarding the border wall funding. So let's start basically with the real basics, okay? The federal government is composed of 3 different branches. Hopefully you guys, this is old news to you, but we know that we have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch at the national level. Those powers are put in place by the US Constitution. So we have the Congress, which is the legislative body made up of both the House and the Senate, the president, and then the federal courts. So those would be any of the Supreme Court on down to the smaller courts, but that are still run by the federal government. The federal government, we know, is in charge of regulating interstate and foreign trade. They are able to declare war and set taxing, spending, and other national policies. So they share some of the same powers, that states do, but the federal government obviously is going to be much larger and in charge, so to speak. So who funds the federal government? Our tax dollars are the biggest chunk of that. So we know that the government raises trillions of dollars in tax revenue each year from we the people. So some of that taxing goes to fund specific government programs. Others are just used to fund the government in general, so to pay government employees, to manage the buildings, and all of those kind of basics that have to be in place in order for the government to run and move along. What is this money spent on? We know that the U.S. Treasury divides all federal spending into 3 main groups. Mandatory spending, that means it has to be spent. This is has to be spent on this specific item. Discretionary spending, that is where the Congress and the president will kind of go back and forth about what is important to spend on a certain item at a certain time. And then we do have to pay interest on our debts. So as our debt climbs, so does our interest payments. So mandatory and discretionary spending account for more than 90% of all federal spending. So the largest chunk of money is going to be spent on this mandatory and discretionary spending. Interest on debt, okay, is a much smaller amount than it is in the other 2 categories, but it is paid on its accumulated debt. So you'll hear that often, the budget deficit and debt. So here is a little graphic. If you see here, mandatory spending, meaning money spent on things like the military, on Social Security, those kind of things, that is the green. Discretionary spending, another big chunk, and then the interest and debt is that smaller blue piece of the pie there. So what do we mean in a government shutdown? So in the United States, a government shutdown does not mean that everything stops. There still will be police and fire services. The military still is funded. So it's usually considered more of a partial shutdown. But this happens when Congress fails to pass or the president won't sign legislation that funds the federal government's operations and its agencies. So what could happen if there is this partial shutdown is that hundreds of thousands of government workers may be furloughed, which means put on involuntary temporary leave, meaning you don't go to work and you don't get paid, which is somewhat a little nerve-wracking for people, especially here right before Christmas. So hopefully we can avoid this situation moving forward. So like I mentioned, furloughed workers will be impacted. So the everyday people whose job it is to help the government move along. That would include most of the people in the IRS, a lot of employees at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Those are just a couple of these big organizations that have thousands and thousands of employees, and those employees would be put on furlough if that government shutdown does move forward. As I mentioned, there are things that still are in place. So the post office will still deliver mail, which is a good thing, I guess, here around Christmas time, since there are a lot of packages going to and from. And the military will still be funded. Some national parks will remain in operation, but the majority of those closed down. So those are just to name a few of the organizations and individual people who are impacted when the government decides to do a shutdown. So let's talk a little bit about the last government shutdown. So the last time that we saw this happen was in 2013. There was a government shutdown for approximately 2 weeks, and 800,000 people were furloughed or basically laid off for the time being. So there are over 2 million federal employees, so not quite half of that group would be furloughed. So what I would like to do now is show you a short clip, and I don't have anybody in here to tell me if this works or not, so hopefully you will be able to see this. This is a clip from, it was put out there in 2013, just to give a brief understanding description of what was taking place during that time. So let's briefly watch that. So I'm gonna do a new share. Let's see here. Okay. Okay, hopefully you can see this. I'll give you this a little 2-minute clip to talk about the 2013 government shutdown.
Government shutdown. 2 words that, if you live in America, you've probably been hearing a lot the past few days. But what does it really mean? On October 1st, 2013, the Affordable Care Act went into effect, making it easier for people with lower incomes or pre-existing conditions to have affordable healthcare coverage. In an attempt to stop this, Congress threatened a government shutdown if the Affordable Care Act was implemented, meaning that at 12:01 a.m. on October 1st, funding for certain government programs was stopped. How are they allowed to do this? Congress is split into 2 parts, the Senate, which is mostly Democrats, and the House of Representatives, which is mostly Republicans. For each fiscal year, Congress has to vote on a budget for the country. In the case of the government shutdown, the mostly Republican House of Representatives refused to vote on the budget if the Affordable Care Act went into effect, which it did. Since the House did not vote to fund the government, many institutions paid for by the government were shut down. People who work at places such as national parks, museums, and monuments will be put on furlough. Spending for essential functions of the government relating to national security and public safety will, however, continue, along with benefit programs such as Social Security and Medicare. While essential government workers will stick around, some will do so without pay. In total, more than 800,000 government workers will be furloughed. Interestingly enough, In the event of a government shutdown, Congress members still get paid. The salaries of Congress members and the president are not subject to changes like government shutdown. And that's about it. For more videos like this, you can hit the subscribe button down below.
Okay, so I wanted to give you that quick little look about the last time that we saw a shutdown. I've got one more short clip that is also from 2013 that gives a little brief explanation from the point of view of individuals that were living during that time in Washington, D.C. So. Let's double check that we have this here. Okay, and this is just a couple minutes long as well.
Washington, D.C. is a federal city in the most literal sense, the seat of the United States government. So what happens when the federal government shuts down?
Well, first I wanted to naturally walk around this area and see the sights, and so I had no idea what was going on today and wanted to snap a photo, but it's all closed off. Yeah, I've never been to DC before. It's my first time, so I would have liked to have gone closer, but it's what it is.
DC's largest tourist attractions, the monuments, the national parks, the Smithsonian, they're all closed. In addition, DC is home to tens of thousands of federal employees, many of whom are furloughed. A trip on DC's metro system confirms this. Normally crowded platforms have become veritable ghost towns.
We were told yesterday that we would have to come in for 4 hours, and then we'll be furloughed for the other 4 if the furlough went into effect. So I'm actually on my way to work so that I can close out my machine and whatnot, and then I'll leave at 1:30 and go home. But worry about it, can't worry. We'll just take one day at a time.
I'm not essential, but I came in to turn on my out of office away message and shut down and lock up. I'm especially in a unique situation because I only started working 3 weeks ago. I just moved here from Boston, so it's kind of ridiculous to move for a new job and work for 3 weeks and then get furloughed.
Yeah, it's such a horrible waste of time, energy, money. Instead of actually doing the work that we're here to do, we've been planning for worst case scenario.
A federal city with no federal workforce? It's an identity crisis and a 1-2 punch on the DC economy that had been largely sheltered from the economic crisis. Local businesses are already suffering from decreased foot traffic.
We have employees and we have families. If this continues, I don't know what we're going to do. I mean, we need to make money. We're here Tuesdays and Fridays, and we get, I would say about 90%. I would say 90%, especially this, it's a federal building area. So yeah, 90% of our customers are federal.
Back on what would normally be a packed national mall, the Washington Monument, icon of the city, would be closed if it weren't already fenced off for reconstruction, an apt symbol for the federal city as it currently stands.
Okay, so just wanted to give you a little brief idea of what kind of was going on back in 2013 when we had the government shutdown. And sorry, just 1 second, I want to get back to this. So again, we saw, a big chunk of the federal employees and staff be laid off. People were obviously kind of upset by that, and we know that that would probably be the case again if we were to see something like that happen. So what's going on now? The possibility of a government shutdown is a real one. It does sound like that Congress and the president are trying to avoid this happening. So last short little clip of the current situation and how we can hopefully avoid a government shutdown like we had in 2013. Just one second, let me pull this up. Okay, again, another short clip, but this is about the current situation in relation to this government shutdown possibility.
They control the purse strings, but for the past...
sorry, just a second, we'll back that up. Okay, here we go.
Congress's job is to fund the United States government. They control the purse strings. But for the past 4 months, Congress has been in a perpetual shutdown watch over a couple basic issues: immigration, whether to fund long-standing programs like the Children's Health Insurance Program, and how to pay for all these natural disasters we saw in 2017. Basically, Senate Democrats are saying, we're not giving you votes for the spending bill until you increase disaster aid for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. The thing that makes funding a government so difficult for Congress is you basically have to do it with bipartisan votes. So that means whatever party's in power needs the other party to cooperate. That also means that that other party gets to put its foot down and say, no, I'm not going to give you votes unless you do X, Y, and Z. That puts both parties in really tough positions, right? Republicans can decide to either compromise.
Wow. Wow.
Or risk getting blamed for a government shutdown happening on their watch. Democrats could get a chance to extract some big policy victories, like on immigration and government spending, but they also might be seen as obstructionists. So Congress's fallback is to pass a short-term spending bill, and experts say that's probably what will happen if Congress can't come to agreement on these big issues in the next couple weeks. But there's a complicating factor here, and that's President Trump. He has been really, really hardline on getting money for his wall, not a fence, not more border security, a wall on the US-Mexico border. That's something Democrats absolutely won't do. So, you know, Congress passes the budget, the president is the one who signs it into law. Never say never with President Trump. It's quite possible he vetoes even a short-term spending bill to try to get Congress to do something on his wall. Passing these short-term spending bills month after month makes it really difficult for the government to function, but things could get a lot worse if Congress can't pass any spending bill and it shuts down. We saw that happen in 2013. And if it shuts down for a couple days, basically anyone who wants to go to a national park, national museums, like all the ones here along the mall in DC, can't. Those are closed off. But the longer a shutdown goes, the more it filters into your and I everyday lives. People who want a passport or visa may not be able to get one in time. Anything that relies on money from the federal government is kind of stuck in the mud right now and has been. The whole thing is just a disaster for the economy. And it also doesn't help the US on a global stage, right? Appear like we have our act together if we can't keep our own government open. What usually happens is Congress comes right up to the deadline and then passes a short-term spending bill that just funds the government at last year's levels for a couple more months while they buy themselves more negotiating time. Basically, this is not the way the government was set up to run, kicking the can down the road every couple months.
Okay, so that is the current situation where we're at. I was hoping to have some discussion about this situation. I don't know if any of you remember the government shutdown in 2013. That was over 5 years ago. So you may not have paid much attention or really known. Some of our older students might have some memory of that. I did want to get some feedback from students about the impact that you felt during that time, those 2 weeks where the government was shut down. So that's something to be thinking about if you're watching this video, this recording, to kind of take a little minute and think if you do remember anything from the government shutdown, if you felt any impact. And then I also wanted to discuss a little bit about the importance of Congress and the president compromising in order to fund the federal government. So we know that President Trump is very hardline. Oftentimes, he definitely doesn't like to compromise on certain issues and situations. We also know that there are members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, who are also very hard line. And so when you get this, I want my way, and the other side, I want my way, and we have a challenge with compromise, what does that say? Like the woman mentioned about us on the international stage. So as other countries look to us, do they see a functioning democracy, or do they see problems and us having trouble just even getting anything accomplished? What does it mean for, obviously, the people who are put on furlough or that temporary, removal of their job? What about the everyday person? Might not affect us too much here, kind of on a basic level at the outset, but again, as if by chance this extends out and as a longer time, we will start to see the trickle down of problems happening because of this shutdown. So I did want to open that up for discussion, but since I'm here by myself, I just would like you to kind of think about some of those things as you are working on this next assignment. So the activity that goes along with this discussion is activity 3.4.1. It asks about how is the federal government funded? So for this activity, you're going to take a survey to see if the people that you hang out with or some people that you spend time around, if they know how the federal government is funded and why it is important to fund the federal government. So the first thing you're going to do is pick 3 people to survey. So that can be family members, friends, your coach, your academic coach, or people at work, anybody that you're kind of around. It's going to be a very short survey. You can do this in person. So if you're at work with somebody and you just say, hey, can I ask you a couple questions for school? You can do this on the phone if you call your grandma at Christmas time or anything like that. And you can also do this on social media. So any of the platforms that you typically use to interact with your friends and family, you can do that as well. You do want to ask 4 main questions. So you're going to conduct the survey. First question, you're going to ask, how many civilian employees do you think work for the federal government? Most people probably won't know this, so just have them take a stab at it. All right. The second question, what types of programs does the federal government fund for its citizens? So what are some federal programs? For example, Social Security would be one. Medicare and Medicaid are examples. So, you can look at that, see what people can pull up for that one. The third question you want to ask is, where do you think the federal government gets its money? Okay. In this question, you'll notice here that we do mention how many employees, about 2 million, 2.1. So you don't have to keep that from people. You can let them know and see how close they were to guessing correctly in that first question. But you want to ask, where does the government get its money to pay the employees and fund all of the programs? Okay, and then finally, question number 4, what is the Federal Reserve System and what does it do? Now, in the lesson that is tied with this activity, you will talk more about the Federal Reserve System, the banking system that manages all of the taxed money that the government gains from individuals and then allocates that to different programs and spending areas. Okay, so you will have some more information about that when you do this specific lesson. All right, then you want to write down what your answers were. So you want to make sure that you've put down question 1, answer from person 1, person 2, and person 3. Okay, so you'll do that for all 4 questions. And then the last thing you're going to do is a reflection. So this is going to be your personal thoughts and opinions. Okay, so do you think it is important for Americans to know these things about the federal government, about funding and allocating of resources? Why do you think that's important, or why not? You might not think it really matters. But you want to make sure that in your reflection, you're writing 5 sentences, which would include your personal opinion, And then 2 examples of how tax dollars are spent. So what does the federal government spend those tax dollars on? Give me 2 examples of that. Okay, so basically like 3 sentences on your personal opinion and then 2 sentences, 1 per example. Okay, so you want to make sure that for each of the 4 questions, you'll set your answers up like this. How many got it right out of the 3 people that you interviewed? So 0, 1, 2, or 3. How many got it wrong? So that's simple math. What was the most interesting answer? That would be, you know, your opinion. Why did you think that was interesting? And what is the correct answer? All right, so you are going to have to know the correct answers to these questions so that you can also give that information to the people that you're interviewing. The rubric for this activity, you want to make sure that you look at the rubric. It is provided at the end of the activity's directions. So make sure that you see that you can either exceed expectations, meet expectations, or if you do not meet it, you would have the opportunity to resubmit that and kind of beef that up to make sure that you are getting full credit. So remember with question 5, you want to have 5 sentences and you want to have 2 examples of that taxation. So I wanted to open this up again for a discussion about the assignment to see if anybody had questions in regards to this assignment. Again, you know, if you're watching this in a recording, you can feel free to reach out to me either in an email, through a chat, or via text message through my Google number, and ask, you know, any kind of clarifying questions that you might have in regards to this situation. Okay, do you have any questions? Please reach out. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this recording. I will be sending out a reminder that this has been placed into the section where all of the other recorded classes are. So hopefully you will have a chance to take a look, and hopefully in a day or 2 we will know if the government is shutting down or not. Fingers crossed that we find a way to compromise enough to get some funding secured and we can get through the end of 2018 without this challenge. All right, guys, thanks so much for paying attention, for being here, and Merry Christmas. Have a great holiday.